Yeah. All right, welcome everybody back from lunch. We are starting our panel on national security. We've got two speakers on this panel. The first one you're going to hear from is David Forte. He is a professor of law at Cleveland State University. He was the inaugural holder there of the Charles R. Emick Jr. Calfee, Halter, and Griswold Endowed Chair at Cleveland Marshall College of Law, Cleveland State University. He has substantial experience during the Reagan administration. Professor Forte served as chief counsel to the United States delegation to the United Nations and as alternate delegate to the Security Council. He has authored a number of briefs before the United States Supreme Court and has frequently testified before the United States Congress and consulted with the Department of State on human rights and international affairs issues. In addition to his academic and international work, he has also been very active locally. He has sat as acting judge on the Municipal Court of Lakewood, Ohio, and been chairman of the Professional Ethics Committee of the Cleveland Bar Association. He's going to be speaking today on Righting the Wrong, Warren Harding, and the Espionage Act. Our second speaker will be Sahar Aziz. She is a professor of law, chancellor, social justice scholar, and Middle East and legal studies scholar at Rutgers University Law School. Her scholarship adopts an interdisciplinary approach to examine intersections of national security, race, and civil rights, with a focus on the adverse impact of national security laws and policies on racial, ethnic, and religious minorities in the United States. She's also the founding director of the interdisciplinary Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Civil Rights, and is a faculty affiliate of the Department of Political Science at Rutgers University, Newark. She has a large number of academic articles that have been published in a variety of law reviews, and she also has a book forthcoming from Harvard University Press entitled The Muslim Menace, The Racialization of Religion in the Post-9/11 Era. She will be speaking on the Muslim Registry, a precursor to internment. So if both of them could join us, that would be great, and we'll go ahead and get started. Wherever you're more comfortable. Either one is great.
I think I'll speak from here. Sahar, is that okay with you? Thank you. Good morning. Afternoon. I have no show. What you see is what you get. I was fated to be at this conference. I was baptized on December 7th, 1941. Heck of a way to lose your original sin. Now, we've talked about the attempts at rectification of the Japanese internment. And I want to talk about the attempts at rectification of the harms done after World War I. Now, we had a precedent for that. Professor Stone has written about this. In 1798, the United States passed the Sedition Act. We were engaged in a war, naval war with France, and the majority Federalists believed that the Jeffersonian Republican Party were active supporters of the enemy, and so it passed the Sedition Act, which criminalized any person who would write, print, utter, or publish anything that was scandalous and malicious against the government of the United States or either House of Congress or the President. Under that act, there were 17 prosecutions and 10 convictions. The act expired the day before Jefferson took office, and he soon redressed the harm of that act by pardoning those who were still in jail, and then later Congress reimbursed the fines for those who were still alive, but not until 1809. But they did allow reimbursement for those who were deceased at the time of 1809 for their heirs up to 50 years later. And now about World War I. On Christmas Eve, 1921, prisoner 9653, also known as Eugene V. Debs, responded to the cheers of 2,300 inmates of the Atlanta Penitentiary as he took leave of them, his commutation in hand signed by President Warren G. Harding. Getting past his tears, Debs was taken to the train for Washington, D.C., for he had an appointment. An early labor organizer, Debs, who was first a Democrat, had read Das Kapital in jail when he had been convicted for violating a court injunction during the Pullman strike of 1895, and then became a committed Marxist. Debs helped to found the Socialist Party in 1901 and the Industrial Workers of America, the IWW, known as the Wobblies, in 1905. By 1918, he had run for president 4 times, gaining nearly 6% of the popular vote, nearly 1 million votes in 1912. Debs was a master politician, but unlike Warren G. Harding, his manner was not compromise, it was theater. Cutting a slim and mild-mannered figure, he always surprised and moved his audiences with his oratory. He would run a 5th time for president in 1920, but this time from his jail cell in Atlanta. He was there because of his oratory. On June 16, 1918, Debs spoke out against the draft in a speech to the Ohio Socialist Party convention in Canton, Ohio. The delegates of the Ohio Party were among the most radical of the party, and their vocal support of Debs apparently impelled him to utter words that would garner him a severe reckoning. At that moment, he himself carried a good deal of outrage, having just visited 3 socialists who were in jail for having violated the Espionage Act. The speech was long, the speech was radical. Comrades, friends, and fellow workers, he began, I realize that in speaking to you this afternoon, there are certain limitations placed upon the right of free speech. I must be exceedingly careful, prudent as to what I say, and even more careful and prudent as to how I say it. I may not be able to say all I think, but I am not going to say anything that I do not think. But as he continued, prudence began to diminish. He called Theodore Roosevelt a toady to Kaiser William. Birds of a feather flock together, he concluded. Then he took aim at the polity itself. They tell us that we live in a great free republic, that our institutions are democratic, that we are a free and self-governing people. This is too much, even for a joke. Moreover, he said, the federal judiciary was an integral part of the capitalist oppression. Who appoints our federal judges? The people? In all the history of the country, the working class have never named a federal judge. There are 121 of these judges, and every solitary one holds his position, his tenure, through the influence and power of corporate capital. The corporations and trusts dictate the appointment, and when they go to the bench, they go not to serve the people, but to serve the interests that place them there and keep them where they are. These words were read, of course, by the members of the Supreme Court, who in a few months would rule unanimously against him. He tread the line carefully between proclaiming peace and urging direct action. He said he eschewed violence against individuals, but not against capitalism. He said, our hearts are with the Bolsheviki in Russia. He urged his listeners, on the one hand, to vote together on election day, but on the other hand declared, political action and industrial action must supplement and sustain each other. You will never vote the Socialist Republic into existence. He uttered words that could be interpreted as lobbying against the draft. They have always taught and trained you to believe it to be your patriotic duty to go to war and to have yourselves slaughtered at their command. And you need, at this time especially, to know that you are fit for something better than slavery and cannon fodder. In the audience were stenographers sent by E.S. Wirtz, the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio. Dispatching a copy of the speech to the Attorney General Thomas Gregory, Wirtz inquired whether there was sufficient evidence to prosecute Debs. He was disappointed in the reply. Gregory wrote, "All in all, the department does not feel strongly convinced that a prosecution is advisable." On his own, then, Wirtz obtained a grand jury indictment on June 29th, charging Debs with 10 counts of violating the Espionage of 1917 as amended by the Sedition Act of 1918. The indictment was 139 pages long. At trial, the charges were reduced to two: willful attempt to cause or incite insubordination, mutiny, disloyalty, and refusal of duty with the military forces of the United States, and to obstruct and attempt to obstruct the recruiting and enlistment services of the United States. Debs was represented by an active and assiduous defense, but at trial the defense chose not to put on witnesses, but requested that Debs be allowed to address the court. The district court judge agreed, and Debs had his platform. For 2 hours, he reaffirmed much of his message at Canton, but this time allied himself with the American founding. Washington, Paine, Adams, these were the rebels of their day, he said. He defended his right of free speech, castigated Woodrow Wilson for his hypocrisy, and asserted, "American institutions are on trial here before a court of American citizens." On September 12, 1918, the jury of American citizens returned a verdict of guilty. On September 14th, at his sentencing hearing, Debs, not a little drunk actually, made one of his most moving utterances, effectively taking the role of martyr. "Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I say then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. While there's a soul in prison, I am not free." Debs was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment and denied the right to vote for life. At his appeal before the Supreme Court, Justice Holmes, for a unanimous court, upheld his conviction, essentially analyzing the evidence as to whether Debs had fulfilled the specific intent requirement of the statute in the law of attempts. Holmes brought the common law to analyze free speech issues. He didn't understand free speech issues in terms of what freedom of speech meant. Debs, of course, was only the most prominent protester who had been prosecuted in what modern historians now regard as a very dark chapter in the history of civil liberties. Thousands more are prosecuted under the Espionage Act or for labor activists for disobeying court injunctions. Left-leaning publications were banned from the mails, and many effectively shut down. The infamous Palmer raids, named after the actions of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, arrested thousands more. At Debs's trial at the federal courthouse on Superior Avenue in Cleveland was Clyde R. Miller, a reporter for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, who had interviewed Debs twice previously. In those interviews, Debs had declared his support for the socialist program of war resistance in their very somewhat radical St. Louis Convention of April 1917. Miller was called as a witness, and he later blamed himself for having to convict Debs. Miller then turned to Senator Warren G. Harding and asked if Harding could do something for Debs. Harding said that if his campaign for the presidency was successful, he would take care of Debs. Harding was a trimmer and a master politician. In the run-up to his nomination, he stuck to what he said was, quote, "the rule that has guided me throughout my political career, which is not to hurt anyone's feelings or to step on anyone's toes if I can find footroom elsewhere." For example, during the 1920 campaign, when the League of Nations was at issue, and the Republicans were divided between three groups: the irreconcilables, who would not have the League at any time; the reservationists, who would have the League with reservations that would protect American sovereignty; and others who supported the League. He steered successfully among the three and got the support of all three. But one thing he was fully sincere in, and that was relieving the situation of those whom he frankly called political prisoners. And he said so many times during the campaign. When Harding took the oath of office on March 4th, 1921, Debs was still in prison. Debs had earlier requested a commutation from President Wilson that even Attorney General Palmer had supported. When Palmer gave the document to Wilson, Wilson scrawled "denied" on Palmer's memo and then said, "Debs will never be a free man while I'm president." Predictably, when Harding took office, a flurry of letters and petitions arrived asking for Debs's release. But Harding had, as he already promised, made up his mind. 2 weeks before the inauguration, Harding told his campaign manager, Harry Doherty, who would soon be his Attorney General, to see what could be done about releasing Debs. Harry Doherty was a political machine operator in Ohio, was Harding's main support in becoming president. Doherty and Harding's outspoken wife, Florence, very much opposed the idea of releasing Debs. Harding's insisted. After inauguration, then, Doherty dutifully arranged to meet and interview Debs in Washington. At Harding's insistence, Debs was released on his own recognizance for the meeting and arrived on March 25th without escort or guard. After the meeting, he returned to the penitentiary in Atlanta. Doherty then penned a long report to his president. Doherty said, Doherty attempted to distinguish between those so-called political prisoners who are sincere in their belief that they have violated no just law and were strictly within their constitutional rights, from those who were and actively, consciously disloyal to the government. But Doherty classed Debs with the latter, and that his imprisonment was justified. Finally, at the end of his long memo to Harding, he opined that the sentence was probably heavier than meted out to most offenders, and that the longer Debs is in prison, the more of a martyr he'll become. In addition, his wife is not well, and meanwhile, the Sedition Act under which Debs had been convicted had been repealed by the Republican Congress. Thus, Doherty recommended not a pardon, but a commutation. The issue of Debs' situation was topical, and popular opposition to the idea arose. The New York Times wrote, "He is where he belongs. He should stay there." Much of Harding's cabinet resisted the president. The state of war with Germany still existed, they expostulated. Releasing one of the most prominent opponents to the war now would be domestically and perhaps internationally embarrassing. Harding accommodated the opposition until the ratification of the peace treaties with the Central Powers were completed in November 1921. Then he immediately ordered Doherty to prepare the release of Debs. He did agree to leave Debs' disenfranchisement in place, but he said the man must go free. He had also been persuaded that a full pardon for Debs' anti-war activities would send the wrong message, so he accepted the idea of a commutation instead. Doherty drew up the release for Debs as well as for 23 other political prisoners, also imprisoned under the Espionage Act. Debs' release was scheduled for December 31, but Harding told his Attorney General to have Debs released before Christmas so that he could celebrate the holiday with his wife in Terre Haute, Indiana. He also directed that the other 23 prisoners be freed on Christmas Eve. To the commutations, Doherty also attached an oath to be taken all those freed that they must pledge to, quote, lead an upright life and obey and respect all the laws of the United States. Doherty did say that to Harding, in the case of Debs, the oath could be foregone, but in any event, Harding overruled Doherty again, and he said, we will not have any oath taken by any prisoner for his release. It would look like, quote, bargaining for an amnesty. Freedom was freedom, given voluntarily by the president, not the result of some deal. But he did append, not a condition, but a request to Debs' pardon. And the request was, would Mr. Debs be kind enough to be received by the president at the White House? Debs was late getting home to Terre Haute for Christmas. Acceding to the president's request, he called at the White House on December 26. When shown into the president's office, one source writes that, quote, bounding out of his chair, Harding exclaimed, Well, I've heard so damn much about you, Mr. Debs, that I'm now very glad to meet you personally. Another source says that damn was Harding's favorite word. Now, think about that. This was the most prominent socialist, hated by Woodrow Wilson, seen as just next door to the Bolsheviks, and the president, in order to heal the country, actually invites him publicly to the White House. After a long meeting, Debs said to the press simply, Mr. Harding appears to me to be a kind gentleman, one whom I believe possesses humane impulses. Warren Harding had just begun. By the end of his first year in office, Harding had granted clemency to 363 persons. Most of them, of course, were not political prisoners. Still, it represented the highest number of clemency grants of any president in his first year of office to date. But those convicted of anti-war activities or of labor unrest were a special case that Harding was determined to address. Above all, Harding wanted to bring the country back to what he called normalcy, as he put it in his election campaign. For the last 2 years of Wilson's administration had been a disruptive disaster. Even outside of the anti-German program, which he abetted, the establishment of a propaganda bureau, the Sedition and Espionage Acts, and the concerted as well as the vigilante persecution of anti-war activists, of labor unions, and the use of the government's suppression of the mails to suppress dissent, Even outside of that, even in ordinary affairs, the Wilson administration had ground to a halt. And that was even before his stroke in September of 1919. Wilson, everyone writes who writes about this period and knows about him, you look at the letters, had become obsessed with remaking Europe and with his idea for a League of Nations. From December 1918 onward, Wilson paid little or no attention to domestic affairs, leaving his cabinet to try to muddle through as an economic depression deepened. Clemenceau said when Wilson was in Europe, Clemenceau said, I never expected to live so long to have Jesus Christ come back a second time. When the League came before the Senate, he refused even to listen to his Secretary of State and soon to be his former friend, Colonel House. At the Senate, Henry Cabot Lodge offered reservations that seemed to many of Wilson's advisors as acceptable, but Wilson had only a take-it-or-leave-it attitude. Wilson wanted the 1920 election to be a referendum on the League. He got what he wished for. Meanwhile, the country's economic and political structure was fraying. At the end of the war, unemployment jumped to 12%. Farmers' surpluses increased dramatically. Inflation went to 14%. In 1919, there were 2,665 strikes by over 4 million workers, 20% of the workforce. The Bolshevik Revolution was cheered by Debs and many others. In Seattle, there was the beginning of a general strike until turned back by the AFL unions. It was a year of terrorism. There wasn't terrorism among the Japanese in this country in the 40s, but there was terrorism in 1919 and 20. Mainly by Bolshevik partisans and Italian anarchists. Throughout the war, mail bombs circulated through the country, some of them exploding, some of them killing people. One destroyed Attorney General Palmer's house. Palmer retaliated with his legendary raids. In Centralia, Washington, Legionnaires and Wobblies exchanged deadly fires. Lynchings, not only of Negroes, were seen in many parts of the country. By his neglect, and sometimes by his support of these events, Wilson was killing progressivism. Debs' verdict on the end of the Wilson administration was, quote, Woodrow Wilson is an exile from the hearts of his people. The betrayal of his ideals makes him the most pathetic figure in the world. No man in public life in American history has ever retired so thoroughly discredited, so scathingly rebuked, so overwhelmingly impeached and repudiated as Woodrow Wilson. Republican progressivism also died when the heir apparent to the 1920 nomination, former President Theodore Roosevelt, died in January of 1919. The country cried for stability, economic progress, peace, and predictability, and Warren G. Harding knew it. He gained 60% of the popular vote, one of the highest percentages, not the highest percentage in history. But what was normal to Harding? First, of course, was support of business and a return to prosperity. This helped energize the economy, brought unemployment down to 4%. but it also placed members of his cabinet in positions to profit personally, and the resulting scandals, most coming to light after Harding's death in August 1923, would taint his presidency. A second part was getting the deficit under control and reducing it. But here, Harding did not return to old times and old procedures. In 1921, the new Republican Congress was finally able to pass, Wilson had vetoed it, the Budget and Accounting Act, and for the first time in American history, a president was able to formulate and propose a federal budget. In his first year of office, also as a footnote, Harding returned to normalcy and diplomacy. His Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, engaged in effective and bilateral and multilateral diplomacy, calling the Washington Naval Conference. For the first time in history, an arms control agreement was signed, tolling for 10 years a naval arms race in the Pacific on capital ships. Harding, meanwhile, told his Secretary of War, the future is air power, start developing aircraft carriers. One other thing, although Woodrow Wilson thought Jim Crow was normal, Warren G. Harding did not. In October 21, he visited and traveled to Birmingham, Alabama, where in a powerful speech to a mixed race, though segregated audience, he demanded justice for African Americans. In the first speech in the South by a sitting president, he argued for full economic and political rights for all African Americans. Pat Harrison, a Democratic senator from Mississippi, was aghast. If Harding's views, he said, quote, were carried into its ultimate conclusion, he said, why, that would mean that a black man could strive to become president of the United States. Harding said that African Americans had served in the country during the war, just as patriotically as whites. Blacks, he said, were transported overseas and experienced the life of countries where their color aroused less of antagonism than it does here. Many of them aspired to go to Europe to live. The service brought African American soldiers their first, I'm quoting him, their first conception of citizenship, their first realization that the flag was their flag, to fight for, to be protected by them, and also to protect them. These things, he continues, lead one to hope that we shall find an adjustment of relations between the two races in which both can enjoy full citizenship. The newspaper report said, in the white section of the crowd, they stood in stunned silence as the black section began cheering wildly. Back in Washington, Harding supported an anti-lynching law, which passed the Republican House but was stymied by the Democratic South-dominated Senate in terms of a filibuster. Now, Harding had an interesting situation in regard to race. He had often been criticized or in those days defamed as having black blood. When he first moved to Marion, Ohio, he wooed the daughter of the most richest man in Marion, who was a Democrat, and he told his daughter, I don't want you marrying a black man. So this is quite interesting. In fact, during the election in 1920, there was an October surprise. A newspaperman said, oh, did you not know that Harding has black blood in him? So this, you would think, in that racist society would make Harding very shy about talking about black rights in the South, but he didn't. And he was the only president to talk about black rights until, I'm not sure even LBJ did in the South, at least for 4 or 5 decades. He also told his cabinets that he wanted black men to be appointed to lower positions, and his cabinet officials approved. So Harding's normalcy was something that revolved around human rights. Apparently noting Harding's explicit program of freeing wartime offenders, the United States Senate requested a list of prosecutions under the Espionage Act. Attorney General provided that list in March of 1922, but Harding had already dictated his policy. He did not wait for petitions by prisoners for commutation or appeal, but he directed Dougherty and the pardon attorney, sua sponte, to review everyone who had been convicted under the Espionage Act. Upon a review of all prisoners held in violation of wartime statutes, those who had not committed acts of violence were to be given clemency. That was his order. There was no clear and present danger test for Harding. Those who merely protested were to go free. Now, there were thousands who had been prosecuted. But by the time Harding got in 1921 to begin the healing process of pardoning those who were left, there were only a few hundred who had not served out their sentence or who had not been already paroled, um, um, and who were still in federal prison. Of course, there were many hundreds others who were in state prison, which he had no jurisdiction of. There were a few hundred then left when Harding came in 1921. When Harding died in 1923, August, there were only 31 prisoners left in federal custody who had been convicted of the Espionage Act. Coolidge released all of them on Christmas Day, 1923. Now, why did Harding do this? It's a puzzle. He certainly didn't seem to do it politically. He wasn't angling for the socialist vote. Uh, He was asked once why he did it, and he said, I just thought it was the right thing to do. That's all he said, simply. But I have a hypothesis. When he was young, he had a minimal post high school education of 2 years. And then he moved to Marion, Ohio, which had 3 newspapers that were extant. He bought the one that was failing, renamed it the Star. And now, Marion, Ohio was, I don't know what it is now, a thoroughly Democratic city and a thoroughly Democratic county, and he was Republican. And so he began being the outlier, the gadfly, and he gained more and more successful, not only successful adherents to subscribers to his newspaper, but influence, and that's how his political influence began. Um, and that's how he met his wife. As I said, the most prominent Democrat in Marion, the richest man in Marion, had told Florence that this man's really a black man, you don't want to marry him, but she married him anyway. So I think it was his experience of being a pressman, of being an outlier, having that experience that gave him this sympathy for other people. And mainly also, he was just genuinely a good man. He wasn't a very faithful husband, unfortunately, but he was genuinely a caring man, and Debs had seen that. And so he brought to an end a healing period, a rectification of the federal prosecution under a Sedition Act, those prosecutions which the Supreme Court unanimously upheld, Warren G. Harding undid. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And if we could get the PowerPoint back up for Professor Aziz's talk, that would be great.
It's truly a pleasure to be back here again. This is my second time at Case Western, and you all never fail to impress the students and the professors. So thank you for inviting me back. And it's truly an honor to be among so many esteemed panelists in the morning and in the afternoon. One thing that stands out about this symposium is the students' thoughtfulness in bringing the human stories to this legal and policy and political discussion and historical discussion, and that's something that unfortunately we don't do enough of at law school. So I wanted to praise you for that. So I'm going to be talking today about a forthcoming article in another journal, but it is to tee up what I will be writing for Case Western, which is exploring the prospect of internment. It's always a political question, but it's also, I think, a legal question. So today I'll be focusing more on the Muslim registry, a prospective Muslim registry, and then hopefully during Q&A we can talk a little bit about the likelihood of internment. So I'll start with a vignette. So for Muhammad and Fatima Salim, it was an ordinary Friday evening preparing for dinner. As their children's gazes oscillated between their smartphones and the television, a public service announcement suddenly captured their attention. A stern voice bellowed out of the television, that the President of the United States hereby declares that to preserve American national security, all Muslims in the United States are required to register at their local post office. Those failing to do so within the next 4 weeks would be deemed in violation of the law and subject to arrest and fines. A chilling dissent filled the House. The Salem children looked puzzlingly at their parents. Why were only Muslims required to register? Asked 13-year-old Yusuf. Would the government close their mosques? Asked 10-year-old Noura. Were they all going to jail? Cried 7-year-old Ali. Muhammad and Fatima had immigrated to the United States 13 years prior from Yemen and were currently awaiting to finalize their naturalization. All 3 U.S. citizen children spent their entire lives in the United States, where they learned in school that respect for different religions was a fundamental American value. Their textbooks taught them the Constitution granted all people the right to practice their religion without fear, and what they heard on television that night shattered those ideals. For the first time in their young lives, Yusuf, Noura, and Ali felt like outsiders in their own country. So this is really my attempt at humanizing what could be a very real scenario in light of what we've seen in the last 16 years and in the last 12 months. Because those of us who have been working on what has now become termed in shorthand post 9/11 discrimination can't seem to find the bottom. We don't know when it's going to bottom out and start getting better. And every time we think, okay, this phase has ended, it rears its ugly head such that it's no longer just a phase, I fear, at least for these particular communities, which are very diverse communities. I term them Muslim Arab South Asians. There are about 3.3 million Muslims in America. That's the low estimate. 6 million is the higher estimate. But they're not a very large number of the population, which also affects their political power, although in some places they're concentrated, so they can make some impact in places like Detroit, in places like Los Angeles, and even in New Jersey. So what I want to talk about today is giving you first the foundation of what has now been called Islamophobia. And Islamophobia is the broader environment. When you think of a hostile or a toxic environment that then can produce anti-Muslim discrimination by private actors, can produce civil liberties violations by the government, and just a general sense of second-class citizenship by people who are deemed to belong to this very heterogeneous group of people. And then I'll talk a little about the history of special registration programs, because this is not new, particularly when it comes to non-citizens, and then explore the law and policy regarding a de jure versus a de facto Muslim registry. So first, just some charts and some facts for those of you who might not be familiar with the environment. And for those of you who are, it might validate it if you sense that there is a problem. So first, as you can see, this is from 2009. The opinion or the perceptions of Islam based on other religions of followers in the United States is noticeably low. Right? People do not have a very positive or favorable impression of Islam. And I'd like to say that that was 8 years ago, and now we can think that, oh, well, things have gotten better, but I'll show you a few charts to go that show that perhaps they've actually gotten worse. This is in 2014. This is a Zogby poll. And in this case, he asked, the questions were both about Arabs and Muslims, and for those who don't know, 60 to 65%, that's an estimate, of Arabs in America are actually Christian. So most Arabs in the United States are Christian, and that's because there's a long history of immigration by Lebanese and Syrian Christians who are now fourth generation Americans, many of whom, not all. So most of the recent immigration of Arabs is by Muslims. So 27% of respondents had a favorable opinion of Muslims, and that's down from 35% in 2010. 32% have a favorable view of Arabs, and that's down from 43%. And again, many people just assume that if you're Arab, you're Muslim. And sometimes if you're Muslim, you're Arab. Although we know that, Islam, there's 1.7 billion Muslims and they come from all over the world. There's a large concentration from the Middle East and the US and a large concentration from Pakistan and India, but there's also Indonesian and other countries. So 42% believe an American Muslim's religion would influence his or her decision making an important government job, which is similar to the type of rhetoric we heard when Kennedy was running for office and people were concerned that perhaps his loyalties would be to the Pope and not to the United States. And this is, so this is kind of rearing its ugly head of, well, whose loyalty? Are you going to be loyal to this country? 42% believe it was justified for law enforcement to profile Arab Americans or American Muslims. And remember, after 9/11, right after, there were calls to profile Arabs by many demographic groups, including African Americans and Latinos and whites. And I remember being very startled to see some of the data in that year, right after the attacks, that there were certain percentages, not all, of course, of people within groups who had historically been profiled who are now saying, yeah, we have to profile because for national security. So this just goes to show that we all are susceptible to accepting policies or supporting policies that might not even be in our self-interest based on what group we belong to, but we can be susceptible to that general sense of hysteria. The Bridges Initiative, which is out of Georgetown, has some great data, and I recommend you take a look at it. And I'm just going to show a few charts today, but this shows hate crimes. Hate crimes are always underreported in the United States or anywhere, but that just shows that it's much higher than before. I think it's like something around 5 times higher than before 9/11. Certainly not as high as the year of 2001, but still troublingly, tenaciously staying pretty high. And then in 2015, which was the peak of the presidential nomination, well, when the Republican candidates were fighting it out for the nomination, there was a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric, including other types of rhetoric, and that had a very direct effect on communities, whether it's individuals being attacked, mosques being vandalized, homes being attacked, and the like. And oftentimes, those aren't the stories that get into the media. Those are the stories I pay attention to as a civil rights professor and advocate and someone who works with these communities. And so that direct nexus between cause and effect, which of course in a court of law are very difficult to prove, but just experientially and observationally are pretty obvious to us. And then to corroborate that, this is 2011, so it's a bit dated. When people of certain faiths were interviewed by Gallup in terms of their experiences of racial or religious discrimination, and again, this is in the past year of 2011, we're showing that Muslims were pretty high up on that list, at least of self-reporting. So take that for what it's worth, but it's just another indicator. Okay, so then you fast forward to 2016, 2017, and this is where, to the extent a Muslim registry would be implemented or promulgated under the current administration, this is when we get into the travel ban litigation and the types of evidence that was brought forth to show that the travel ban, in fact, was not facially neutral, but that it was motivated by religious animus. And of course, there's much debate among legal scholars as to where the record starts and should what he said as a candidate count against the executive branch in terms of the courts looking behind the executive orders to see if it was legitimate or bona fide, but that's not here. I just want to show that this would be the type of evidence that could be brought forth. And this is not just for a court of law, but this has in fact affected public opinion. So I'm not going to read that because you all can read it for yourself, but I guess the last one I do want to read. I think Islam hates us. There's a tremendous hatred there. There's an unbelievable hatred of us. We can't allow people coming into this country who have this hatred of the United States and of people that are not Muslim. So it's interesting here is how the victims are being portrayed as the aggressors. And so you have 3.3 million people here who otherwise are actually feeling very vulnerable and very exposed to the government's actions and also to their neighbors, their co-workers, and other private actors, and yet they're being portrayed as if they're the enemy. And of course, that's because those 3 to 6 million people are being presumed to all be members of ISIS, all be members of Al-Qaeda, and that somehow because those terrorist groups are claiming what they're doing is in the name of a particular religion, then everybody who follows that religion axiomatically has given them an oath of allegiance, which I think we all know is factually, there's just no evidence of that. So this is not based on facts. And as a result, public opinion has been affected, and it is partisan, is what we're seeing, at least as of 2016. This is a Brookings study or poll. The question is, Islamic and Western religious and social traditions are incompatible with each other. And so Republicans said yes. This is closer to what I believe, 56% of the time, and Democrats said no, yes, 26%. The question, most people in the West and the Islamic world have similar needs and wants. It is possible to find common ground. Democrats said 71% yes, Republicans 41% yes. And the reason why that matters is because in order to promulgate and implement discriminatory practices and policies, you need to dehumanize. You've got to show they're different, right? This whole otherization. And so clearly there is a significant portion of the population that does agree with that, particularly along partisan lines. And you know, that's just something we need to pay attention to the extent that you have a particular party who has control of the Congress and control of the White House, and then you have supporters who have certain views. The likelihood that these types of actions will take place is higher, and therefore even the subject of what I'm talking about today it's not as alarmist as someone may think, right? This is really more about the plausibility of that outcome. And then again, another one, this is more about viewing Muslims as violent, which is important for the national security framing, which would be the justification or the rebuttal to the religious animus motivation. All right. So in 2016, Trump states we're having problems with the Muslims and we're having problems with the Muslims coming into the country. You need surveillance. You have to deal with the mosques, whether we like it or not. These attacks aren't done by Swedish people, that I can tell you. So this was something that was, before the travel bans or the executive orders were passed, but he didn't seem to know or didn't want to acknowledge that in fact surveillance has been happening for the last 16 years. The NYPD has arguably been working with the CIA. It's a little unclear, but there are some former CIA officials that were involved in this very systematic mass surveillance program that affected even the university that I'm now at Rutgers. And security risks, people who had security risks, the types of criteria that they use, the NYPD endorsing conservative religious beliefs, businesses that had devout Muslim customers, mosques of concern selected based on ethnic orientation, group affiliations, political views, and that's how you were targeted for this surveillance. They sent out mosque crawlers and rakers to go out and effectively find terrorists, and there are many stories and anecdotes, well, mainly stories from investigative reporters. If you look at The Intercept, they've done some good work on this, of people who were paid a lot of money as informants to go into mosques and essentially rile people up. They'd identify young men who seemed like they were good bait, and they would take them offline and they would say, let's plan a plot. What if I can get you this, you can get me that, and as long as they could show there was predisposition, then they wouldn't have to worry about an entrapment defense. And they just provided the means and opportunity, and they were, the FBI is pretty good at getting the right recordings to show predisposition. But there's a lot of concerns within the communities that those who are being indicted, people aren't convinced that all of them were in fact bona fide terrorists. There is a suspicion that some of them, not all of them, are kind of bait. They were preyed upon by very sophisticated informants and undercover agents. So all that just to say that for at least 10 years, you had all of these entities and individuals that were being spied on, and then by fortuitousness, just complete good luck or bad luck from the NYPD's perspective, someone discovered it, and now it's been in litigation. And those of you who have followed it, you may have noticed it's still going up and down. Okay. So that is a very quick, abbreviated kind of summary of the general environment, and I want to move now to special registration programs. So the special registration of non-citizens has been around for a decade, for centuries, and it's not really that interesting legally, because it isn't, it's kind of part of the immigration plenary power doctrine concept in the government's authorities to regulate immigration and persons who are not citizens. So you had the Naturalization Act of 1798, where everyone, now although that was ultimately aimed at extending the naturalization period from 5 to 14 years, and I think historians, some argue it was because of making sure certain people couldn't vote within a certain time because something was, there was elections coming up. But what's often overlooked as part of that act was also a registration component of persons who were not citizens and those who were arriving. You also had registration as part of the broader targeting of Chinese immigrants and migrants. Most people know about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is both the denial of citizenship and naturalization, but and the moratorium on immigration. But again, there was also a special. I don't know what I just did there. I'm sorry. There was also the Geary Act of 1892, which required special registration, and if you failed to do so, you're arrested and deported. And then you have the alien enemy registration after World War I, the era that Professor Forte was discussing before and after that. And again, similar concept, except this time they were targeting those who they believed were native citizens, denizens, or subjects of a hostile nation or government. And the Enemy Alien Act, which is 50 U.S.C. 21, is still on the books, which actually gives the government the authority to deport citizens of countries in which we are at war with. And in many ways, so in other words, Trump, or any president in theory, could go and say, I'm going to deport all of those who are Pakistani citizens, all of those who are Egyptian citizens, like all the Muslim majority countries, but the country has to be at war with that country. Well, most of our enemies are non-state actors. It's Al-Qaeda, it's ISIS, it's many militant groups. So that's why that hasn't been used. So it also created an inventory, and ultimately over 480,000 were registered as of 1915. Okay. And then there was the Alien Registration Act of 1940, similar concept, focusing on subversives and communists. And again, just keeping track of people, trying to identify who has the values or the political views that we find threatening, and then presumably surveilling them and presumably even deporting them. There we go. Okay, so let me just, this is kind of the details. All right, so now I want to get to NSEERS, the National Security Entry and Exit Registration System, which was passed in 2002. And it was in effect until 2011, and then it was repealed in 2016, 2 weeks before Obama stepped down. So it was not, the timing was not coincidental. And this was effectively a special registration program for non-immigrants, males 16 to 55, I believe, or 65, from 25 countries. 23 of them were Muslim majority, plus North Korea and Cuba. And it was always amusing when you would hear the public speeches by the government responding to claims that this was actually a de facto Muslim registry, that no, that we also included the Cubans and the North Koreans, and so therefore how can it be about Muslims? But again, 23 out of 25. And they had to get fingerprinted, interviewed, photographed, and there were all sorts of regular registration that they had to engage in. What was really problematic about it, practically speaking, is that it was such a success that the government couldn't handle it. So all of these people, thousands of people, went to register voluntarily. They were already here. The ones who were coming in, that's easy to register them because you just set a system in place. But the challenge was those who were already here, all the non-immigrants that were here from those 23 countries. And some of them never found out, and they just didn't get noticed if you were in a small town, or if you didn't hear it through your local mosque or your local church or your community group. And then many of them showed up and were in long lines, and people said, you come back, we'll call you. No one ever called them. They thought, oh, okay, I don't have to register. So ultimately, years go by, they go to adjust their status or seeking some immigration benefit, And it turns out they were in violation of NSEERS, and many of them had acted in good faith. And so there were a lot of lawsuits attempting to fix that, but it continues until today to harm people's statuses. Ultimately, 2,870 people were detained, and almost 18,000 were deported, or at least attempted to be deported. So it was notices to appear for deportation, and then whether they had relief or not, depends. But that's a lot of people. 85,000 men ultimately registered, and at least now, the government's not very transparent, but according to advocacy groups and those who have attempted to get to the facts, only 11 were prosecuted with possible links to terrorism, and everyone else was just kicked out of the country. Well, if you're truly a threat to the country, you don't usually send them back where they could join a terrorist group and engage in violence against U.S. interests there or here. So if you're sending them back, they're probably not really a threat. So the view from the community perspective was this was racial profiling. You're just trying to kick out as many Muslims as you can out of the country. You don't want us here. Sorry. There we go. Ooh. This is not. I need a clicker. Technology problems. Okay. All right. Okay, so the NSEERS provides a model for what is the de facto Muslim registry for non-immigrants. Right? So we're not talking about immigrants, which is legal permanent residents. We're not talking about citizens. So with the de jure Muslim registry, which is if you are it's like the vignette I started out with. If you are a Muslim, you must register. Doesn't matter what your immigration status is. I think legally it's not a very interesting question because the Establishment Clause is pretty clear. And I think particularly when you think of the evidence that was used for the travel ban executive orders, is that the Establishment Clause clearly states that you cannot treat one religion better than the other or give preference from one religion over the other. Okay, and you have the two tests. Now, admittedly, I am not a First Amendment scholar, so if we have those in the room, please feel free to weigh in during the question and answer time, but the Larson test would apply because it would just be facially discriminatory, and the question would be really, can the government show that requiring all Muslims to register is narrowly tailored for the compelling government interest of national security? And national security will be found as a compelling government interest. It pretty much always is. But not all Muslims are terrorists. Not all terrorists are Muslims. And there's nothing about Muslim identity that correlates with being an increased risk of harm, notwithstanding whatever stereotypes people hold. The facts just aren't going to show it. And right now, with the increase of white nationalism and white supremacy, and which is a political ideology that is causing some, not all, and it is a minority of people, but they are using violence in the name of that ideology, which is a form of terrorism. And so if they're going to do that to Muslims, it's going to be hard for the government not to say, well, if you believe in this ideology, we're going to have to make you all register as well. And if some of them are doing it in the name of Christianity, well, I guess Christians, you're going to have to do that as well. Now, we know that's an outrageous proposition and nobody would accept it. Well, why isn't it equally outrageous if you're saying it about Muslims? Right? Because I don't see much of a difference if you take out the stereotyping. And the other thing that's really fascinating, and this is something that I'll probably write a little bit more about for the paper, is in the IRAP v. Trump case in the Fourth Circuit, before, when it went up to the Supreme Court and got vacated, but is this acknowledgement and recognition that stigmatization, stress, and anxiety caused by anti-Muslim animus was a recognized injury, as was separation from family and experiencing the significant fear, anxiety, and insecurity. This is effectively what hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million people have experienced in the last 16 years. And so again, that was for standing purposes, so doctrinally I'm not sure how that would fit, but that is something that I think future litigants might be able to creatively use to their advantage. So a de facto Muslim registry is, so my assessment is it's legal for non-immigrants based on NSEERS. And for immigrants, I think it's going to be a harder sell, and I will leave it to the immigration specialists to think about that and query it, but I just wanted to point out the laws that are already in place. The second one's supposed to be 1302, 1303, and 1305, so I'm sorry, that's a typo. But the Attorney General can register aliens, can identify special groups, but it's only for those that are not lawful permanent residents. And now we have U.S. Visit, which effectively requires everybody to have to register, so our sophisticated technological advances have allowed it where there's no more reason to say, well, we have to pick this group, and so focus our resources. Everybody is now having to come in and provide their biometric information. Okay. And so I think it will really come down to, similar to what we talked about, or what was discussed in the travel ban cases, is the Lemon test and whether the government action has a secular legislative purpose. And this is where it depends on whether we have an administration that learns from the past or continues to make the same mistakes and expect that a different result will come out. I think that was Einstein's definition of insanity. Anyway, so if they continue to put out rhetorical statements that are anti-Muslim, if they continue to engage in certain policies and practices, that can all be used to pierce through their claim, the government's claim that this is secular legislative purpose, which is the national security. Okay, and I just want to, this is a quote that I think was really insightful. Invidious discrimination that is shrouded in layers of legality is no less an insult to our Constitution than naked invidious discrimination. And I kind of thought, in a nutshell, we lawyers can appreciate that. But that's, I think, what it's going to come down to in the future. So finally, I'll just kind of go to the end, is this is the question we all have been asking. I think no matter where you stand politically, where which communities you belong to, but we all have different scenarios in our heads. And so what if another major terrorist attack happens on U.S. soil? My opinion, and it's been that opinion since 2001, notwithstanding the last 2 or 3 years of our political developments, the environment is very, very fertile for an extreme reaction. By the government and by, I would say, 40 to 50% of the public pushing for it. Now, of course, you still now have another 50 to 60% who will push back. And we saw those people in the airports protesting the executive orders. We saw them advocating. And I think that's what is the silver lining in terms of being supportive of civil rights and civil liberties, is that it's not going to be as easy for the executive to push through rights infringing policies if another attack occurs, but there will be some support for it. And then finally, the question is, will there be internment? And I will just end with this quote here from Korematsu, which a couple of these which were really chilling in some ways. And so the one quote is, "The apprehension by the proper military authorities of the gravest imminent danger to the public safety," that was essentially justification, and that essentially hardships are part of war, and war is an aggregation of hardships, and so the Japanese have to also, experience hardship. And Korematsu was not excluded from the military area because of racial prejudice or hostility to his race. He was excluded because we were at war with the Japanese Empire, because the properly constituted military authorities feared an invasion of our West Coast and felt constrained to take proper security measures, because they decided that the military urgency of the situation demanded that all citizens of Japanese ancestry, and that's a key term, ancestry, not citizenship, be segregated from the West Coast temporarily. And finally, because Congress, reposing its confidence in this time of war in our military leaders, as inevitably it must, determine that they should have the power to do this. So if we have another terrorist attack by a particular group, will the ghosts of Korematsu come back, and will we be kind of relitigating it, and maybe we should, in order to finally bury it, I hope. Thank you.
Okay, we don't have a ton of time for questions, but we have time maybe for a quick question, if anybody in the audience.
How many Sikhs and Hindus have been targeted in error?
A lot. Actually, Sikhs in particular. Sikhs in particular have been targeted quite a bit because of the turban being mistaken for the turban that Osama bin Laden wears in many. It's worn frequently in Afghanistan for cultural reasons, and even in places in Iran. So yes, that is anyone who is perceived to be Muslim, Arab, and then I use South Asian because most people won't be able to tell that someone's a Pakistani Muslim versus an Indian Muslim versus an Indian Hindu. So yes, they have been victimized by that prejudice.
Great, thanks so much. I think, thank you please help me thank the panel for their wonderful talks. I believe the panel members will also be around later in the break if people have other questions that they want to ask at that time.
They let you do it too. Yeah. Okay.